many of you know how to take someone's vital signs if needed? Imagine yourself driving along an interstate, heading out of town for a big event. You're driving along and suddenly, out of nowhere, a car spins out of control. A passenger is ejected out of the vehicle and is laying 100 feet from where you stopped your car to help. What do? The passenger is not responding to verbal command. How do you know if the individual is still alive? You thought to yourself, if only I knew how I could tell if this individual is still alive, I'd feel a little bit better. But you don't know how to tell. Or, your aunt has had a severe headache for the past 4 hours. Her words begin to slur, and she can no longer move the right side of her body. What do? Understanding the need to check a blood pressure is vitally important in this scenario because your aunt is having a stroke, but you would have no idea she's having a stroke if you can't check a blood pressure. Understanding how to take a pulse and a blood pressure can come in handy in moments like the previous scenarios. It's not every day that someone witnesses a car accident or you witness your aunt having a stroke, but you never know when you could save a life simply by knowing how to take a pulse or a blood pressure. I know most of you are wondering, what does this have to do with an everyday person like yourself? Well, I'm here to tell you I once was an everyday person and didn't know how to take a pulse or a blood pressure. I was in church one day and we had a man and he was sitting in the church balcony. He fainted and no one knew why. One of the men ran down, grabbed my father to help. My dad, being an EMT and a firefighter, this was his second nature and knew what to do. He immediately took the gentleman's pulse and noticed it was entirely too low, and figured the same with the blood pressure. From that day on, I thought to myself, I wouldn't know what to do if this situation happened again. And what would happen if my dad wasn't there? I didn't know how to take a pulse, and from that day on, I was determined to learn how to take the vital signs, a pulse and a blood pressure, just in case I needed to know how. And look at me now. I'm heading to school to be a nurse, and therefore understanding how to take vital signs could save a life one day. Before we begin, you'll need a few items. You'll need a watch with a second hand, a stethoscope, and a blood pressure cuff. And could I please have a volunteer from the audience to please come forward? There are 2 places that you can take a pulse. Here in your arm, right here in your wrist, it's the radial pulse, and it's located on the thumb side of the arm. You can take your index finger and your middle finger, and you'll simply just place them slightly below the thumb. And you add a little bit of pressure, and you start to feel a beat. This is known as the pulse, or the heartbeat. Once you feel the beating, you look at your watch, and after you have felt the beating for 5 seconds, you begin to time it. We will time for 1 minute. After you time the pulse for 1 minute, the number of beats you have felt is the pulse rate. The next spot to check the pulse is in the neck. It's called the jugular vein. This one is used when more in a critical situation when the radial pulse is not found. You will slightly place your fingers in the crease of your neck and just add a little bit of pressure. You'll be able to feel the pulse. Knowing how to find a pulse in either your radial area or your jugular area is very important like in the previous scenarios. You would have been able to tell whether the person was alive or not. Next, I will show you how to take a blood pressure. We'll use the blood pressure cuff and the stethoscope. On the blood pressure cuff, there are arrows, or a circle or a line. This blood pressure cuff has arrows. We're going to use the individual's upper arm, and we're going to line the arrows up with the vein that runs through the upper arm. And it's usually the vein that they take blood out of, and so you can normally see it, and we'll line it up just like that. And you want to make sure the blood pressure cuff is tight, but not too tight because then you can get a falsely high reading. This is your meter that you will read. It has numbers 0 through 300. And as you use the pump and squeeze the blood pressure cuff up, we will see the arrow rise past the 200 mark we'd like to start with. And then you slowly release the dial to the left. And as you slowly release, you'll listen for the first heartbeat, which is your top number, and the second heartbeat, which is your bottom number. You have the individual rest their arm down so they're more relaxed. You're going to go ahead and place the stethoscope in your ears and place the stethoscope just slightly under the blood pressure cuff, right over top of that vein, so you can hear the heartbeat. So we'll go ahead and pump the blood pressure cuff up to about 200, and then slowly release the dial to the left and listen for the first heartbeat, and then the second heartbeat. Make sure you tell the individual their reading. Your blood pressure was 116 over 64. Take the blood pressure cuff off and dismiss the individual. Thank you. Learning how to take vital signs are easy. There are many places that you can take a pulse and a blood pressure, but the radial pulse is the most common, and the upper arm is the most common also. By a show of hands, how many of you have learned a very vitally important information today? Good. Just remember, someday you might need the skills you have learned here today to save someone's life. Don't push this in the back of your mind. This is simple, but it's also life-altering. Thank you. My audience today is my mom, Jane, my sister, Natalie, my brother, Nick, and my father, Rich. Thank you, and have a great day.